So I'm going to be talking about services and Airbnb. And just before I talk more about what we've been doing at services at Airbnb, I wanted to take the time to introduce myself and my company. I recently realized that not everyone has heard of Airbnb, and I should explain it so that my domain examples make sense. Um, Let me just read out the official spiel. Airbnb is a community marketplace to list, discover, and book unique accommodations around the world. So what this means is that people from all around the world rent out everything from their spare room to their apartment to their yurts, and you can rent from them. So this is the slideshow of places around the world that you can rent on Airbnb, from a castle to a teepee. I'm kind of sad to say that I haven't been to any of these places, but it's on my to-do list. So when we like to dog food at my company, so when I was coming to Madison, I thought I should find a place to stay with somebody from Madison. And hey, there are lots of hosts from in Madison. And I'm staying with two nice Wisconsinites, and I found out there's actually Wisconsinites and not Wisconians on Wikipedia. um, and I'm staying in Bay Creek, which is quite a nice neighborhood. Yes. All right. So now I'm gonna talk about um, the monorail, or how we've been dealing with the architecture of our Rails application here at Airbnb. So in the beginning, about 5 years ago, a team started building an app. So when we first launched the company, we didn't know whether anyone would even want to rent out their spaces on online. I mean, it's a crazy idea, right? And the number one priority at that point is to determine if there's a match between the product and the market. And you don't want to build a very nice product that nobody really cares about. And in the beginning, the priority number one is quick iteration. And for that purpose, I think all of us agree that Rails is great. There's separation of concerns, and we have separations between the model, view, controller. We have database migrations, all the stuff that Rails provides us for free. And I know that some of you guys have seen 1,000-line models. But I just want to assure you that I'm pretty serious about this, because PHP. I found this online, Principles of MVC for PHP developers, and it's baked into our Rails framework, which is great. So, and this is where Rails really shines. Or should I say, this is why Rubies on Rails really shine. Pun intended. So over time, the story goes is that your app gains traction and you start building on top of that. Maybe you want to allow people to pay online instead of having to do a cash transaction or maybe you want to allow people to block other users, all sorts of other things you want to implement. And for a while, it could be as simple as adding more controllers, more models, just another caboose on your Rails engine. And this works well for a while, but maybe it gets harder and harder. And one day you find that the system becomes so complex that you can't figure out what's going on in your application. And you make a change and it breaks something somewhere else in your slide, somewhere else in your application. And the previous graph where as time goes on, you find that your product gets more popular. It's a graph that just basically goes up and to the right. And that can also express how complexity grows over time. So as your business becomes successful, complexity also tends to grow. And there's a limit to how much stuff that can fit in my head. Even all of us, the smartest of us, can't fit 10,000 lines of code in our head. Or if you can you contact me? I would like to recruit you. So the term monorail, which we use very cutely to refer to our monolithic Rails application, it might sound cute, but we shouldn't forget that it stands for monolithic Rails application. And the dictionary definition of monolith is a large stone structure, essentially something which is difficult to change. And there are some key reasons for not liking a huge Rails application. it's a difficult conceptual model. It's when you get to hundreds or thousands of models or hundreds of thousand line files, it's hard to figure out where exactly should change. Even my code editor, when I type Command Shift O to open a file, it takes longer to find the right file when it's a bigger application. And the second part is upgrading is difficult. When has any one of you guys ever put off a Rails 3 upgrade? Yeah, in the house. With hundreds of thousands of lines of code, it's hard to figure out where exactly you need to change things to upgrade it for the next version. And third of all, it's easy to break stuff. So I just thought I would do some statistics to figure out why I feel like the build is always red on bigger teams. And I think this is a really cool calculation of why this happens. So this calculation is based on, if I break the build 1% of the time, how long does it take before the build is red? So if you have only one person on your team, it takes 100 days or 4 months before the build is broken. If you have 10 people, that's take 10 days, which is 2 weeks. But if you have 100 people on your team, it's likely that it's probabilistically average that the build will break, every day. And I can't remember where I saw this, but yeah. Yeah, this is a treatable moment. But yeah, I saw this on Stack Overflow a long time ago, and I thought it was just so appropriate because you change some behavior in your system and you think it's not gonna make a difference. It's change the implementation and you don't think it's gonna make a difference, but then you fuck it up and then it becomes a refactor. So over the past few years at Airbnb, we have successfully extracted several HTTP services from our monolithic Rails application, and I wanted to share some of the mistakes and lessons that we have learned from this. So, what is a service-oriented architecture? It's a set of discrete pieces of software that provide application functionality as services, usually accessible over HTTP. Or another definition is a system made of several composable parts called services that work together to make up a single application. So at this point you might be asking, when you want to decompose a really large, messy Rails application, is that the only solution that you could have? And this is a chart that I actually found from somebody that I used to work with that kind of diagrams where along the spectrum you can be in terms of decoupling. All the way from monolithic Rails application to a full-fledged HTTP service-oriented architecture over the side. And in the middle, some key middle points would be like extracting shared behavior into modules, gems, or Rails engines. And I've actually used quite a few of these techniques in the past. I've actually used gems and engines. And it's not a rigid dichotomy between monolithic Rails application and service-oriented architecture. There's a spectrum of ways to separate concerns. But for the challenges that we have, which are being able to scale and to iterate quickly and deploy quickly, those problems aren't solved easily by any of the other solutions. So if we look back at this, almost everything up to 1 to 5 restricts you to the same technology stack. And if you're interested in learning how to use gems or engines to separate out shared behaviors, I really recommend this presentation by another person who I used to work with. It's really good. So a common expression of why specialization leads to efficiency. Discrete systems lead to specialization, and specialization leads to efficiency. And this sounds like it's applicable to humans, but it's also applicable to software systems as well. And I would like to say that the corollary to this is that the more discrete the system, the more specialization it affords. By using services instead of engines, you can customize the technology stack and allow it to become more specialized at whichever task it does, which increases efficiency. So for us, what this looks like currently is that our Rails API, which talks to different services to get information. So imagine when you first look for a place to stay on Airbnb.com. You say, I want to come to Madison in August. And so the first thing that the app has to do is to look for all the different listings in Madison and the surrounding areas and figure out which is the best for you. And then after that, it needs to determine which of these listings are available by searching the calendars which the hosts have provided, which days that they are available to host. And then the third element is a pricing service, which dynamically prices your stay, just like how airlines do it. So each of these services have really different concerns and really different things to optimize for. Like for search, one of the things that we are figuring out is how to best rank listings for a given person. Or for calendar service, one of the big problems is scaling because there are a lot of listings and calendar information can be provided in a variety of different ways. Similarly for pricing. So one way that I would summarize this is that by extracting out into a service, you get the benefits of quick iterations. And you also get the benefits of getting getting very fine-grained scaling. So for instance, if there are lots of hits to our search for some reason, we can easily scale up that service without having to handle the performance inefficiencies on that part of the system. And this is a really important question for Airbnb as we scale our site, and we just hit 7 million users, and we start asking ourselves, what's the best technology for application logic, for user interface, and for persistence? It might not be important on day one, but these questions start becoming more important. I mean, Rails is definitely good for up to a point. Our site has been working well for the past 5 years, but what happens when we're up to 10 million users? Another point I want to note about this is that the answer to this question isn't static either. Better technologies come along. Right now, Rails server-side rendering might be the best solution for serving a user interface, but in the future, JavaScript client-side apps might become a better solution. And the next question is, if Rails is the best technology for any of these domains, and if that's not the case, what cost are we paying by continuing to develop within Monorail? Or another corollary is, what does it mean to ask this question? Even if we determine that Scala might be a better technology for a calendar service, how can we use these learnings in a Rails application? And by splitting our application out into different HTTP services, we have managed to leverage a variety of different services for different parts of our application. For instance, for a mobile website, we use a node server to serve the request, which actually improved our application performance by 5 times, which is really important for mobile. And we also use Rails, Java, and JRuby. So for a project that's been adding models, controllers, and presenters or what have you be for the past few years, it's actually really hard to safely extract these logic from all over the application. And I want to talk about some of the best practices which we have developed over the past few months. So I kind of took a leaf from somebody else's talk yesterday of coding myself. Extracting the first service out of Monorail is always the hardest because there are so many challenges of safely extracting it and developing deployment tools and establishing best practices for development. So this kind of sounds like a really obvious thing, but testing at different levels of the stack is really good advice for safe refactoring, especially if we are doing big things like moving it to a different service. So for us, how this works in our service extraction workflow, which sounds like something from chemistry class, to be honest, and it's actually something that I came up with. We didn't talk about it like that. So we determine the domain to be abstracted, which is usually kind of non-trivial because the behavior is usually scattered throughout the application. We extract the logic into service objects and convert it into an external service. So as an example, which is an example is a user authentication, user creation and authentication service. It's a pretty realistic example because the focus of this is quick database. When you create a user creation service, you usually want to focus on quick database I/O, focus on data integrity, and encoding business logic. And these aren't really things that Rails are good at. Rails is good at. Interesting. So here's an example of what extracting this might look like for a user's controller. So in the Railsy way, when you create a new user, you would do user.createParams user, and all the business logic around validations of a user would go in the model class. Like for instance, you might validate the first name and you might validate the middle name, but only if the user is in the United States. Which is kind of one of the most annoying things that I find about web applications when they require a middle name, because no one outside the United States has middle names. So what this might look like to move this into a service object, the first part is to extract the domain logic from the persistence logic. So what we might do is create a service object called user registrar that does the checks and persists it to the database if necessary. And if in this like structure of the code, it's not that difficult to imagine moving this into a separate service that is communicated to over HTTP. And what you would do is that you instead of doing all those checks in your service object, you would do a post and then parse the response of the service. So in this approach, this is kind of like an really oversimplified example of how we try to iteratively move from code that's all over the Rails application to a service-oriented approach. And what I've kind of outlined is an iterative workflow for moving this logic slowly. And throughout each of the process, you want to make sure that you aren't breaking stuff. And so it's important to make sure that we are testing at multiple levels throughout. So what this might look like first would be creating unit tests for the model, making sure that the validations work, then adapting these to the service object as we move logic over there, and then adapting them for an external service, like testing that if you submit invalid user parameters to the user object, you get back a 422 instead of a 200. So hopefully this is all transparent to the user of the service, but we also use integration tests to make sure that each of the individual steps use the right interface. And that's actually kind of non-trivial for us because one example is that when we were moving our search to a separate service, we found that sometimes parameters weren't expected in the same format on the service side and the consumer side. And what this meant was that a nil parameter was interpreted as a call to destroy everything. So it's important to have integration tests when you're having services. These testing practices make sense in the context of an iterative workflow, but it will be possible to kind of parallelize developing a new service as well. And for instance, if I was continuing developing a Monorail and my friend was developing a user service, we could use these practices to make sure that the interfaces were what we expected. Another big question of deployment strategies that come along with choosing to develop a separate service is that deploying multiple applications with separate dependencies is kind of complex, not to be an understatement. And what we use is that we use Chef and Chef to manage our deployment processes, although Puppet would fulfill kind of the same role. And we treat our deployment our Chef repositories the same as we treat our Monorail application, that we use pull requests to conduct code reviews and make sure that we are building competency in deployment processes. So one big issue which I'm not really talking about here is versioning, as you want to add more features to your API. The API, as you want to add more features to your services, the API would change. But this is also a whole nother topic and a whole nother can of worms. So one good heuristic from the person who helps manage our deployment: the number of chef roles should grow as quickly as the number of services. So I think it's good for us to take a step back and try and figure out how services approach to services fits into the overall direction of our company. So using these services, we have been able to iterate on individual services quickly, choose the best technology for the purpose, and also try new technologies, and scale individual services independently. And for us right now, this is what it looks like. But in the future, who knows what it's going to be like. And adopting this service-oriented approach can allow us to scale, to add more features to our Rails application without being overwhelmed with our complexity in it. So that's all the I have for you, and I'd like to take questions. So if there aren't any more questions, thanks for your time.